Welcome to the FutureCon panel, Future North America, Raising the Stakes in Canada and the USA. I'm your moderator, Claude Lalumière. I'm the author of more than 100 stories and 5 books, including Objects of Worship and Venera Dreams, A Weird Entertainment. My work's been translated into 8 languages, most often in French, Spanish, and Italian. I'm a Francophone, but I write exclusively in English, originally from Montreal, and I identify as a Montrealer. I now live in Ottawa, and pertinent to this North American panel, I've lived in 3 Canadian provinces and 2 states in the US. My website is claudepages.info. To you, our audience, please use the comments in the panel's YouTube page to ask questions. They will be relayed to me, and I'll do my best to integrate them into the flow of our conversation. And now, let's introduce our panelists. The futurist and SF writer Madeline Ashby is an American expat now based in Toronto. She's the author of the Machine Dynasty series and has developed SF prototypes for Intel Labs, the Institute for the Future, World Bank, the Atlantic Council, and others. Find out more about Madeline at madelineashby.com. Welcome, Madeline. Welcome, Madeline.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Hi. Next, James Patrick Kelly is a multiple award-winning American author. His fiction has been translated into 21 languages. His most recent book is King of the Dogs, Queen of the Cats. Find out more about Jim at jimkelly.net. Welcome, Jim.
Hey, how are you doing?
I'm fine. Yourself? Great to have you.
Happy to be here.
Good. Next, we have the Seattle-based writer, editor, and journalist Nisi Shawl, the author of the Nebula finalist Everfair and the James Tiptree Jr. otherwise award-winning Filter House. Some notable anthologies include Stories for Chip, a tribute to Samuel Delaney, co-edited with Bill Campbell and with a story by your moderator, and New Sun's original speculative fiction by people of color. Find out more about Nisi at nisishawl.com. Welcome, Nisi. Hi, it's great to have you here. Jean-Louis Trudel holds degrees in physics, astronomy, and the history and philosophy of science. He's the author of more than 30 books in French and more than 150 stories in French and in English, which have been translated into multiple languages. Jean-Louis is a specialist in the history of science fiction in Francophone Canada. Originally from Toronto, he now lives in Quebec City. You can follow him at culturedefutur.blogspot.com. Welcome, Jean-Louis. Good to see you.
Glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Great. And finally, we have Ashby Divya. She is the co-editor of Escape Pod. Her debut book is a collection called Contingency Plans for the Apocalypse and Other Possible Situations. And her debut novel, Machinehood, is forthcoming from Saga Press in March 2021. She holds degrees in computational neuroscience and signal processing, and she worked for 20 years as an electrical engineer before becoming an author. Find out more about Divya at sbdivya.com. Welcome, Divya. Great to have you here.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
All right. So we're going to start with a loaded question and see where we go from there. So, in sharp contrast to H.G. Wells' utopian socialism, classic American pulp SF, especially as championed in Astounding and its editor John Campbell, it promulgated imperialist capitalism and libertarianism. Can the North American expression of the genre break free from that deeply embedded and often unexamined political bias? Let's start with Jean-Louis, since he suggested most of this.
Thank you, Claude. That is indeed a loaded question, and one that I think requires perhaps some context, and because to understand where I'm coming from. I identify as a Franco-Ontarian with Métis ancestry. And of course, I know the science fiction of written in French in North America, something that is a very small segment and relatively unknown outside of its Canadian borders. And yet, what strikes me when I look at the overall genre is, especially in the last 50 years in North America, in the US and Canada, has often been the lack of attention to politics. Now, it's not only about, imperialist assumptions. It's also sometimes you could say ordinary politics. One example I could give you is that in recent years in Quebec, there's been at least 3 alternate histories of Quebec written by imagining what would have happened if the referenda of 1980 and 1995 had been different. And, given the size of the populations, proportionally speaking, this would lead me to expect in North America or in the US, something like 100 novels imagining, let us say, an Al Gore presidency or a Hillary Clinton presidency. But I don't see that. I'm not aware of everything that's written, but it seems to me that there's often been a reticence outside of a few people like Kim Stanley Robinson to engage with actual North American politics. So I'll leave it at that. Oh.
Why don't we follow up with Divya, since she seemed to have a lot to say about this as well?
Sure. So I would say that my experience has been a little bit different, perhaps because I have spent the last several years steeped in short fiction. That's what I started out writing, and that's what I've mostly been reading. And the things that come across my virtual desk at Escape Pod, as well as what I've seen in other magazines, I think do engage pretty deeply politically, even within United States fiction authored by United States residents. I don't know that they've been always alternate histories, but certainly alternate futures, and certainly not shying away from engaging with discourse about governance, about surveillance, and even about the political system itself. But for novels, the one book that came to mind immediately is Malka Older's Infomocracy, which builds an entirely new geopolitical structure across the entire globe, not just within the United States. And I think makes a really good case for what that might look like and how it might function. And then, of course, exploring all the fun problems that might derive from those situations. But there are others like the Revolution Brought to You by Nike by Andrea Phillips. That was one that we ran, and where it is about an election, and it's about the influence on it through a marketing campaign, right? And it really kind of examines how politics has changed commerce and vice versa. So capitalism and democracy are, much more entwined, especially in the United States, because of Citizens United, because of letting corporations be legally given a lot of rights of personhood, but also to be able to contribute politically. So I think we see that, I see that reflected pretty solidly in short fiction. Maybe not so much in novels. Like but beyond Infomocracy, I didn't come up with a ton of deeply politically interrogative novel-length fiction in recent times. But by the same token, I feel like everything that comes out today has some political influence, much more so than sort of the unconscious political manifestations of Golden Age science fiction. I think authors today are much more conscious of making social commentary as part of their books. This is one of the things that certain segments of fan society complain about, but I think overall most people have engaged with positively and are open to this concept that, you know, the personal is political, and therefore the fiction you write, which is inherently personal, is also political.
Yeah,
I think that Nisi, yes, go Nisi.
The personal is political. Yes, I agree. And what I am at odds with is the idea that the personalistic is political. It is, because everything is political, right? But I understand the question as coming at this from the viewpoint of privileging the personalistic viewpoint, the perspective. I have some counter examples. You mentioned Malka Older. Also, there's Chris Brown, who Claude and I were just on a panel with, actually, but Tropic of Kansas, Failed State, very definitely political, very definitely imagining quite a different world. Also, Cory Doctorow's, well, there's Little Brother. There's also my favorite, Walk Away, which does envision a different political order and actually envisions how we get there, which is so unusual for science fiction to do. It's not just a leap, you know, you know, the aliens brought us this technology or something. It's actually the praxis, the way of getting there. So yeah, I think we can do it. To me, the hang up is the idea that there are certain people who tell you what will be successful as an author. You can have a little more experimentation at the short story level, which is, I think, why you're seeing that, Divya. But when you get to big houses putting out novels, a lot of the time they will just be completely oblivious to any other sort of setup than the status quo. Am I right?
I think that Jean-Louis has a retort to this.
Oh, well, I just wanted to kind of continue a bit. Infomocracy is on my pile of books to read. And going back to, in some part, to the original question, I do feel, yes, that in the last couple of decades, there's been, with movements like solar punk and hope punk, and the reaction to contemporary politics, a definite political treatments in science fiction of various issues. What often seems to be the trouble for me is that there are, yes, lots of dystopias, and sometimes also kind of approaches that are diverging quite radically or quite clearly from our modern day world without necessarily engaging with the present day world. And these comebacks, and this comes back perhaps to issues of what about, what can we say about everyday politics or tomorrow's politics without skipping right away to the politics of 20 years down the road, 30 years down the road, or post-singularity politics. But I'll kind of leave it at that. I see somebody else wanting to speak.
Jim.
Yeah, so I really agree with a lot of what's been said, but I feel constrained to pull back and look at North American science fiction as it exists on the ground. I mean, the things that you folks are saying are the things I write science fiction for. Engage science fiction that takes the future seriously, takes our decisions seriously. But Nisi sort of touched on this. the science fiction I see when I look at book racks, when I look at the science fiction community, most science fiction writers know absolutely nothing about economics. Any economics that appear in their science fiction is as magic as the magic in Harry Potter. The bank accounts are infinitely extended. And so there's really not a problem putting spaceships together or founding colonies or inventing stuff. Okay, so, but leave that aside. I mean, going to your question, I think this is in some ways baked into North American science fiction and maybe into science fiction in general. So part of colonialism is expansionism. And there is a hardcore center of science fiction, which is we got to get off this planet. We've got to explore the universe. Man's place, or humanity's place in the universe, means we got to go out there and we got to find stuff. We got to exploit stuff. We got to get out there in those in the asteroid belt. All this stuff is part of, I think part of what many people think science fiction is about. So there's that, and in that sense, I think that's very serious science fiction too. I mean, in some ways, there's a critique to be made of it. But I also have to think there's a lot of science fiction that is not advocacy science fiction, that is not engaged with our problems. Lots of science fiction is using our science fiction background as tropes to tell stories. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with entertainment science fiction. But geez, if I look at the bookstores, I mean, thank goodness there are short story writers, because I think short story writers in general are not quite as entertainment oriented as the big publishers, and also in the indie publishers, the folks who are out there churning out novels and novels and novels. I think they're just using science fiction as a trope in order to tell stories, which is fine. But in some ways, it makes me think that the things we've talked about are as important as they are, is in some ways a very small fraction of the scene that's happening here in science fiction. And I'm going to hide.
Why don't we have the last word on this question from Madeline?
Thank you. First, I would say that if you're interested in this book, this type of exploration, I would recommend a project from my friend David Forbes called The Old Iron Dream, which was investigating sort of the conservative roots of Golden Age and Pulp Age science fiction. So sort of the secret political histories of everybody who sort of quote unquote created the genre. And she kickstarted it years ago, and it's still like one of these projects that kind of informs people at a level that they might not have had before, I think. And certainly that's a conversation that seems consistently germane year in, year out. So I would recommend that. But in terms of the baked in nature of North American science fiction and sort of and capitalist imperialism, or capitalism or imperialism, or however you want to make the beast with two backs out of those two issues. I think that there's something about American exceptionalism that is baked into the idea of the hero of 1,000 faces. When somebody asks you how to write a pulp science fiction story, or asks you how to write a genre story, period, whether it's a fantasy story, a science fiction story, sometimes even a detective story, anything like that, there's always this, messianic hero figure, and there's, he goes on this journey and what have you. And that tracks to the American identity, specifically the colonialist identity, specifically I'm going to go out there and, be challenged by the wilderness and create my identity through these challenges that I totally brought upon myself, and so on. So I think that I think that the story template, no matter which of those genres you're operating in, reflects a kind of exceptionalism upon that certain political systems, including stuff like libertarianism or conservatism, are sort of based on the idea that you are supposed to go it alone, the idea that no one should help you, the idea that that you can't rely on anybody, that you can't trust anybody. Those things are baked into what we think of as being a hero, to our great detriment, I would say. And so that's where I think it's kind of baked in.
Yeah, no. Sorry,
Okay.
but I have points of disagreement both with you and with Jim, because I find it very, very entertaining to think of non-Joseph Campbellian stories, and I find them everywhere that I look. Not in every book, every place that I go that has books, and what I was trying to do with Everfair, and what many others are trying to do, is have fun with other models. By the way, I really I gag upon Joseph Campbell, actually. He does not do much for me, let us say. But yeah, I was talking about this personalistic approach to story. No, you don't need that. You can tell stories, communities. You can be the genius of the people that you are representing. Yeah. Sorry, but no.
So I will add to that. There were a few things from my notes I forgot to mention, but again, kind of pushing the forefront, I will say that, yeah, the hero monomyth dominated, especially I think it dominates even more maybe in epic fantasy than it does in space fantasy, but there's definitely some crossover there. But I feel like even in pop culture science fiction on TV, we have now The Expanse, and before that we had Firefly, and before that we had Star Trek, where we've had ensemble narratives, right, with ensemble casts and not necessarily William Shatner notwithstanding. But later Star Trek, let's say, that we've started acknowledging that family and friends and support are an integral part of success in life. And then for, I guess, sort of non-standard narratives, I wanted to bring up Yoon-Ha Lee's Nine Fox Gambit and that series, which have been very popular, which I was gratified to see because I really like those books. But that's, again, not your typical hero narrative. And I think having more American and Canadian immigrant authors who are bringing in cultures from other continents with them as part of their experience has shifted the narrative for a lot of books. I think that's been a positive influence, and I think that also helps us move away from colonialism for sure, and imperialism as a side effect of that. And I personally love stories that bring in family, not just found family, which has been a trope in Star Wars and maybe earlier, but actual family ties, which I think for myself, like with my novella Runtime, family is the reason that the main character goes off and does what she does, and family is who she comes back to at the end. And I come from a culture where family is paramount. Like, you put your parents, your grandparents, your children, your aunts and uncles before anything else pretty much in life. And so it's very hard for me to disentangle that from the fiction I write, even though I've been in this country since I was 5 years old, and I'm very steeped in libertarianism thanks to my Indian but deeply liberal libertarian dad. I still say that you can have both. You can have hero stories that are not lone wolf hero stories and that are not anti-hero stories. And you can have heroic things happening at small scales. And I do think we're starting to see that. I think it's recent, maybe in the last 5-10 years again, but hopefully we will see more of that in our future.
Okay, well, one question that leads well after what we just heard from Divya is, what's the future like for the USA and Canada? And how will that impact the SF that's produced here? Why don't we start with Divya, since what she had to say kind of led into that.
Yeah, I guess that feeds off of this idea of the immigrant narrative, which I'm seeing more of, which I love. I recently read The Lesson by Cadwell Turnbull, I believe. And that, I think, Nisi's book, Everfair, is an alternate history colonialist story. The Lesson is an alien invasion colonialist story. But both of them kind of interrogate similar sorts of themes. And we're seeing more of that interrogation happening, I think, with, at least with US fiction. Maybe one of the Canadians can speak more to the Canadian fiction. But I think it's become an important part of our future. And at least for a good chunk of the US, it's become part of our identity. I'm in Southern California, and we are, the classic melting pot, right? You have people from all over the world. You have pockets of deeply meshed original cultures mixing in with American cultures, both influencing each other. And I don't really see that we're going to be able to separate that from the fiction that we write going forward.
Thank you. Why don't we go to Madeline, since she is an American who lives in Canada. She has experience with both the US and Canada. So what are your views about the future of both of our countries? And,
okay, not the future of SF in both of the countries.
Right, well, both,
Okay.
like both the future of the countries and how those futures will impact the fiction.
Right.
Since you're a futurist on top of that.
I am. So I often I get asked to write stories based on sort of ideas that are in development at the time and sort of how people might use them. And I write about technologies that are in development and so on. And I've done that for American and Canadian clients. I will say that I now tend to focus my fiction on Canada because I've lived here that much longer. I've lived here for 16 years now. And also because it's easier to imagine a future with more things in it in Canada. When I get asked to write optimistic science fiction, I usually write it set in Canada. Because the writing is on the wall. What I tend to do when I'm asked, the other reason I like to write about Canada is that Canada has been incredibly supportive of me as an artist, and it is incredibly supportive of artists, or can be. I wrote a novel called Company Town for Tor Books, and in 2017 it was a Canada Reads finalist, which means that my book was the subject of a reality show and was debated by among other people, an opera singer named Misha Brigger-Grossman, who defended it down to the last final day in front of a bunch of other writers. And it lost, in fact, to another genre novel called 16 Dogs, which is a magic realist novel about conscious dogs. And I think that what I learned from that was that Canadians in particular sort of don't get addressed as much as they would like to in future fiction, or fiction about the future. I went to Newfoundland, where the book is actually set, and I had people come up to me who said, no one ever writes about us having a future. All of our fiction is about the past. All of our stories are about, the Newfoundland that was. And I had written a murder mystery set on an oil rig, and they got really excited about the idea that someone was actively considering the implications of that particular future. So I like setting things here because there's more possibility, frankly, and there's more definition to be done. There's sort of more room to run, more tarmac. But also because I think Canadians are used to sort of being left out of that conversation in a lot of ways. And when you bring them in, they get very excited about it. And I always like writing to an audience who gets excited about that kind of thing. So so that's why I tend to now be focusing more of my fiction here.
Right. Okay. So when we speak of people who are not thought of in the future, yes, there are Canadians, but what about Francophone Canadians? And on that, let's go to Jean-Louis.
Of course, if you've read some of the recent books by Derek Kunsken, you'll find out that he's been writing about Quebecois tyrants in the futures based on Venus, which is an interesting thought, and actually kind of matched one of my future histories where a future Venus was indeed Francophone, speak Francophone. But to go back to your original question about both the future of Canada and the future of Canadian science fiction, including Francophone Canadian science fiction, I see three possible forces for the future, future of Canada. On the one hand, as in the US, Canada is going to be more diverse. Immigration is going to continue enriching the cultures of Canada. But perhaps unlike the US, I feel, and I may be biased here, but I feel that the future of Canada is going to be more Indigenous, especially in the prairie provinces and in the north. The Indigenous populations are playing a more important role and seem to be well placed to increasingly be present in Canadian politics and in determining what Canada is going to look like. The third force is, in a sense, obviously the US, but probably in a sense, the US coupled with climate change. And this is, of course, where I'll let my other panelists tell us about the future of the US, but certainly the future of Canada is going to be determined by what happens in the US politically, and I would say in terms also of climate change, because that may well end up impinging on Canada. The observation by Madeline that in her reflecting the opinion of indeed many people that there's not enough Canadian futures in Canadian science fiction seems pretty apt. And there's a whole story to be told, I think, about how Canadian science fiction in particular has been shaped by actually a lot of immigrants. Robert Charles Wilson was born in the US. Donald Kingsbury came to Canada from outside Canada. William Gibson. You can actually write a fairly long list. And Elisabeth Renarbourg in Francophone Canada. People like Joël Champetier and myself are second-generation immigrants, so that you have a body of Canadian science fiction that is in some ways perhaps not as rooted as in other places, though of course the influence of immigrants on US science fiction is pretty obvious as well. But the future of science fiction in Canada perhaps indeed lies in a reconnection with Canada. What I like to point out is that two of the recent winners of the Governor General's Award for Fiction in French basically wrote science fiction. One of them was Caroline Georges with De Synthèse, and which has been recently translated into English as Imago, I believe. And then you have, and before that you had Christian Gay-Poliquin's Le Poids de la Neige, which has been translated into English as well. I can't quite remember the title. There are Italian, Catalan, and perhaps Spanish translations as well of that book. And while De Synthèse is kind of an unrooted book, takes place in partly in Europe, partly in Canada, Gay-Poliquin's Le Poids de la Neige, it happens entirely, well, though it doesn't say, it's pretty clear to me that it's a village in Gaspésie. And it's an experience of basically a post-apocalyptic winter in Gaspésie, a very wholly, utterly Canadian experience, one that followed an earlier book called A Fil des Kilomètres, which did not win an award, but which involved the character, probably Québécois, coming back from, again, it was unsaid, but probably something like Fort McMurray in Alberta, through going from there to Gaspésie in Quebec. So that may be a future, that may be something that we'll see in the future of science fiction in Canada, more Canadian futures, as Madeline was saying.
Jim, can we hear from you? I think what you have to say is a good follow-up to what we heard from Jean-Louis.
Sorry. Yeah, sure. So I'm thinking of the role that science fiction is often played as an escapist literature. And when I think about the future of the United States and to some extent Canada, I see trouble, I see fires, and I see political unrest, and I see a lot of people thinking about they don't want to look at the future. And that has been an ongoing, I think, identity crisis for science fiction as a genre where we're talking about the future. And so we've seen a lot of science fiction that sort of looks away from our near future into the far future. And we've seen a lot of other kinds of speculative fiction, which isn't concerned with the future at all. They're secondary worlds and portal fantasies, and which, once again, I'm just observing. I'm not judging here. I read them myself. I love them. But so the other thing to think about is that the genre of science fiction is sort of an artificial creation of the North American publishing industry. My own understanding of the way that fantastic fiction is viewed in other countries as just the spectrum of what is possible to write about. And so there's a certain convenience to the science fiction audience of genre to say, okay, well, if we're in space, then there's not going to be any witches, and if we're in a fantasy world, well, there won't be robots. And I think that other cultures, the boundaries between science fiction and fantasy are much more permeable. And to some extent, I think that is a future of North American science fiction. There are many in the mainstream who have somewhat, I don't want to say they have no sympathy for the science fiction enterprise, but they certainly are coming at it a different direction, who are happy to write about science fiction ideas. And for most of those writers, it is dystopian apocalyptic. And so they're like discovering, oh, well, there's this new thing to think about, which is the end of the world or the collapse of civilization. Let's write about that some more. So I think that one of the things to say about the future of science fiction in North America is that it's having an identity crisis, and depending on how the next year or 2 years play out, that identity crisis may be resolved in any number of ways, and only a futurist knows which they will be.
Yeah, I had some stuff to say, and I just have to do a hard agree with what you were talking about with the genre interpenetration there, Jim. It's something that I've remarked on. In like the work of Nnedi Okorafor, for instance, she's writing about alien invasions and roads coming to life, and I see that a lot. I did this whole write-up of the 42 books to read for the history of Black science fiction, and kept coming across this thing where it's sort of fantasy, but people have hands made out of televisions, and maybe it's sort of technological. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's a big part of the future. What I am most interested in is sort of the idea of having families of choice, which is an idea that has some roots in the LGBTQ community. And I've also seen it in the Black community, you know, have aunts with no biological basis. And I'm sure, you know, in other communities as well, you have families that you come together because you're taking care of each other. And heaven knows we need to be taking care of each other right now. There's crisis after crisis, you know, like Jean-Louis was saying, there's, you know, fires, you know, there's hurricanes everywhere. So there is an idea that we can form these communities, these families that are not birth families, but are important and are core to what's going on. And I see that affecting science fiction very directly and very economically, on a very economic basis. Crowdfunding is a big part of this. And I think that that direct link between having a community of people who are interested in a certain kind of story and having them fund it is going to be a big part of what happens next with science fiction. That's what I say.
Okay, we have a related question from the audience that is an elaboration of what you've all been talking about. And it is, do you believe that the future of North American SF is a mesh with immigrant stories, themes, and preoccupations? Why don't we start with Divya, because I think this is mostly a riff on what you were saying earlier.
That's a broad question, so I don't want to generalize that broadly and say all American science fiction is meshed with the immigrant experience, other than many, many Americans are immigrants or their ancestors were. But I think we are, like I said, seeing more immigrant influence on the directions and themes and types of stories that are told in American science fiction. And going beyond even just the immigrant experience, I want to also bring up the internet experience. We have created, you know, what was originally the World Wide Web. And so America is absorbing a lot of entertainment from outside of America much more than it used to, whether it's literary or film or TV shows. And like one of the really obvious ones is Japanese manga and anime. And that's had a heavy influence on American storytelling and what the American audiences are comfortable with, but also what they enjoy. And I think, you know, this is it's a feedback process, right? Where as audiences get into other types of narratives, other types of settings, writers are more able to produce those stories and to sell them to publishers or Hollywood or wherever. And so I think this is hopefully a positive feedback cycle that we're going to see going forward, that this will create much more variety in the types of fiction that gets published by, you know, the big 5 US publishers, or that gets published in the Canadian market. And I won't even get to translations because I think that's a separate question, but this is, you know, this is literally the influence on American authors writing in English. We can't help but absorb storytelling that comes in, especially through pop culture from other parts of the world. And so that, I think, is another way that American science fiction is changing. So it's not just immigrants, it's everyone, you know, 3rd, 4th generation Americans are also being affected by this.
Okay, well, I think that leads well into our next question, which is, do you think that more readers and writers are now consuming more fiction in translation? And is that having an effect on the SF that's produced here? Why don't we start with Jim, since he's the most American of all of us.
Here's my flag. I say yes, of course. There's no question about that. Although I have to say that the inroads that science fiction from other languages, translated from other languages, as much as we've seen in the last even 5 years, is still, I think, just a very small part of the total picture of what readers are reading, and science fiction readers are reading in this country. But absolutely, I mean, I think the thing that is maybe a cutting edge here is that if you're a writer, if you're writing science fiction, all of a sudden you really have to be reading Indian science fiction. You have to be reading Chinese science fiction. You know, before, okay, well, we'll read French. You know, that would be like a really exotic language for many, alas, of our North American language deprived writers. But I mean, I think that this is a thing, is that as more and more writers show up from other cultures, translated from other languages, show up on our tables of content, you say, well, who is that guy? And what does she have to say? And what is her aesthetic here? Because it isn't quite like mine. So, I mean, I think this is the thing that many writers are busy doing. And so, and of course, I think that one of the things that FutureCon SF, and we can tout our own, blow our own horn here, is that this kind of convention, multicultural, multinational convention, just sort of wakes people up into saying there's a whole lot of more science fiction than we are seeing in the pages of Asimov's or even Escape Pod, you know, and they're pretty diverse. So yeah, this is a thing where, as a practicing writer, a professional writer, I need to read this stuff so I'm keeping up as best I can with what's happening in the world, because it's now really a world literature and not just a North American club. And we let a few people from other cultures in every so often if we like them.
Right. So you mentioned French, which is, I think, a good lead-in to have Jean-Louis say a few things about multiple languages and translation. Go, Jean-Louis.
Well, thank you. Well, of course, the Francophones were there first, in a sense, because consuming translated science fiction has been a defining element of Francophone science fiction, the experience of Francophone science fiction readers since roughly the post-World War II period, the 1950s, when translations from the US science fiction started arriving. And before that, of course, English science fiction, British science fiction had been arriving in France as well. But the main discovery, the main brunt of it, was in the 1950s, roughly speaking. And so there's been generations of Francophone readers who've basically grown up with not so much Jules Verne as the experience of reading Asimov in French translation, or Heinlein, or other authors. And starting around the 1980s or so, Francophone publishers in France were usually pretty active, in fact, in terms of searching out and translating science fiction from Italian, Eastern Europe, and elsewhere. So the Francophones have been kind of immersed in discovering science fiction through translated eyes for a long time. But of course, the English, in a sense, or the Anglophones, I should say, have an advantage because, as has been discussed elsewhere and at other points of FutureCon, English is this bridge language, and most countries and cultures around the world that are not non-Anglophones are going to be translating into English, or going to be pushing into the Anglophone market. So you have that aspect that is, so that nowadays, sometimes, once upon a time, you might get an author like Stanislas Lem getting into English through a French edition. But nowadays, you might get, as we heard, say, Liu Cixing being translated into Japanese versus partly through an English translation, I noted from an earlier panel. So that is certainly going to lead to a different world of science fiction.
I just wanted to say that this thing of translated works affects me directly because there are what are called dialects of English. There are certain vernaculars, different speech patterns, which I find being more widely accepted, and I trace that to the idea that there are more works available that are translated. At the same time, I worry because I see some works in which people are marked out as different because of a way that they speak or idioms that they use, and these are rendered in such a way as to give the impression that someone who does not speak in English is stupid. And I'm thinking of a specific book here, actually, but it's a widespread enough phenomenon that it's not just the idea that works are translated, but that there are translations of people's speech patterns when they're speaking in an Anglophone work that can be troublesome. I'll just say troublesome, yeah. I would be interested in hearing if anybody else has come across this phenomenon.
Sorry, go ahead. No?
But I was going to jump in and say, yes, I have come across that phenomenon. And it's been interesting at Escape Pod because we podcast all of our short stories. So when there is something that is a dialect, it needs to be read as such. And so I don't know that we've had audiences feedback come back biased against it necessarily, but we definitely try to make an effort to find native speakers of dialects, not necessarily, it's still English, but it's Creole or it's Southern. And so it helps to have, I think, someone who is fluent in that speech pattern read it. I wonder if, well, I know you're trying not to name names, but I think there are, I think maybe some of what you're saying is born out of real bias in the United States against certain segments of our society, and bias against those segments translates into bias against how they are represented in fiction. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah. Yes, I see that, as well as I see also the kind of thing that you're talking about, where people, because they are opening up to new storytelling conventions and stories from people who do not were not originally speaking in English. The stories were not written in English. Because of that, they're more open to, I guess, translations within English is what it amounts to.
The question of dialects is a little interesting because, of course, both me and Jean-Louis have a different experience of that because we are Francophones, and of course, the dominant French is not necessarily ours. Why don't you say a little bit about that, Jean-Louis?
Well, there's an interesting history there, first of all. Back in the 19th century in Anglophone North America, French Canadians were sometimes caricatured in various ways, including linguistically. There was I think an English Canadian poet who made a whole career of having Quebec French Canadians basically speak a patois form of English, wrote poetry, wrote stories, I think, and it was profoundly exoticizing. On the other hand, just know that in passing, and I think I'll let Claude talk about Quebecois French because he's from Quebec, so I'm not going to get into that. But I did want to make the point that in French literature and in French writing, there's less of a tradition of reflecting dialect. There have been attempts, especially in Quebecois literature, where you wanted to kind of reflect the kind of French spoken in Quebec. But in the overall, you could say, Francophone tradition of writing, and if you look, for instance, at the translations of American SF into French, there is very often a kind of flattening or de-regionalizing of the original English to turn it into a standard French that is just lightly inflected to reflect, let us say, the fact that this was originally perhaps written in a kind of Southern U.S. English, or maybe backwoods English of some from Kentucky or something. And in French translation, it becomes much closer to what you could call standard French, with only a few markers of dialect. And the reason for that are probably too long to get into here, but did want to make that point about the differences. And there are, as I said, some French Canadians have also been the brunt or the object of that kind of exoticizing in North American English language literature.
Yes, just before we go to the next question, I will elaborate, since Jean-Louis asked me to. It is one of the things with French that is very different from most other languages is that spoken French from any region is very different from literary French. And there are conventions in written French that are very different from the way that anyone speaks, even in Paris. And it makes the language very hard to learn from reading because no one actually speaks that way. So, but that's a whole other thing. Let's go to another question, again from the audience, and it riffs off something that we heard from Madeline, and it is, how does the U.S. SF community seek to decenter U.S. voices that are rooted in American exceptionalism, considering also the dominance and capital of U.S. publishing markets? Let's go to Madeline, since it riffs off of something that she was talking about.
So the question, if I'm hearing it correctly, is how do American writers decenter that experience, or how does American fiction decenter that experience? So just read that core part of the question.
The question said the community. So that includes the writers, the readers, the editors, the publishers, everyone. So as a group gestalt, how do you decenter that?
Well, I think that something that that Nisi and Divya both talked about was sort of talking about alternative family structures, or the expansion of the family structure, or deepening into the sort of using fiction to explore the family structure, and talk about sort of the way that identity is woven in a collective, that you are connected at all times to other people, and that you aren't alone. And further, to sort of talk about, ensemble casts, and the way that all of our voices are sort of shaped by the voices around us, and so on. But really, what I think if you could do any one thing that sort of got away from it, that got away from the exceptionalism, that got away from going it alone, that got away from as has been pointed out, a very outmoded view of heroism, it would be to explore vulnerability, and to say that that vulnerable people are also not just heroic, but whole and complete, and that you are incomplete until you have explored vulnerability. Because I think that that's the thing that, especially in genre, there's a lot of there's an allergic reaction to a lot of vulnerability, and to a lot of taking time to think to oneself, or isolation, or self-reflection within fiction. It's considered more of a sort of quote unquote literary trope to spend a lot of time in inner life and interiority, especially in genre, sort of more classic genre editing, whether it's short stories or novels. There's a lot of like, if it's not moving the plot, then it shouldn't exist. And that doesn't leave a lot of room for interiority, and it doesn't leave a lot of room for protagonists in particular who are vulnerable. And I think that's where I would if I were to actually like tell some, if I were workshopping something, or if someone asked me like, hey, how do I get out of this, this mode, it would be to explore vulnerability, because in general, American fiction, and in a lot of ways American society, is completely allergic to the notion of vulnerability at all. Because vulnerability is seen as weakness, it's seen as feminine, it's seen as frail, it's seen as disgusting, it's seen as, it's woven with how we see gender, how we see disability, how we see race, how we see everything. And so I think that like, whenever you can put your thumb right on the bruise and twist, that's where you're doing good work. And I think that's the Achilles heel in a lot of, speaking of heroes, it's the vulnerability, the weak spot. That's where I would focus.
I think Jim has something to add to that.
Very quickly. I mean, to me, it seems that American exceptionalism is proportional to the national confidence, and our confidence, the Americans' confidence in our government and in our society has been steadily eroding since the Vietnam War. We're looking at several, 3, 4, depends on how many you want to count, wars that didn't work out the way we thought they would. We're looking at a government that seems unable to meet the needs of most of the people. And so I think that one of the things that in the same way that science fiction is having a crisis of confidence, the American people are having a crisis of confidence. And that exceptionalism, I think, it's still there. But I think when people say, I don't think this is such a good idea, the right-wing science fiction and the right wing of the American politics will say, but that's the way we always did it. And I think that's one of the things we see in macro in our current political situation, but also in our genre, where there is not an insignificant, but I think a smaller fraction than used to be, of right-wing science fiction people who totally believe in American exceptionalism and and are drinking the Kool-Aid by the gallon.
And I think that's a good lead into our next question, actually. So you've got the past, but what about the future? Do you feel that current trends in SF, like Afrofuturism, Hope Punk, and Solar Punk, are affecting the SF that's being written and published today in the USA and Canada, and will it affect it more in the future? Why don't we start with Nisi?
Yeah, I was going to say it had a very direct effect on me, because Everfair, earned out its advance, and this is unusual in a novel, and it was, I was getting like a few thousand in royalties every year, and I went to tour with a sequel outline. And they said, oh, no, Everfair is not making enough money. That was right before Black Panther came out. So very, very direct, visceral effect. Of course, they didn't realize that my novel starts out in Da Nang, spends a bunch of time in Sri Lanka. We're not headed like straight for Wakanda there, but yeah, the Afrofuturist moment, if you will, definitely helped me get a contract to get my next novel published. I sure hope it's having a positive effect on the rest of y'all.
So yes, what about the rest of you? Do you feel that your writing is influenced in any way by any of these trends? What about Madeline?
I always you know, part of my job is sort of looking at what's happening at the margins of places and seeing how it trickles into the mainstream. And so you can see a trend that was, you know, that for me is like 10 years old or something like that, and it's like suddenly new because now Netflix is doing it. To Divya's point, I think that there are a lot of writers today who grew up with what Henry Jenkins calls like the pop cosmopolitanism of having anime, manga, K-drama, Nollywood, Bollywood, like all of that available. And there are very valid questions of appropriation there that are you know, that I myself alone cannot answer and need to be a conversation. But the broader availability of voices from everywhere, for as long as that continues to last, because it's all dependent on there not being a great firewall of American internet. We'll see how long that lasts. But the availability of that, I think, does have this broader ranging impact, and you have seen it on in fiction trends. I think I've seen a lot more fiction. I myself have written a lot more fiction, you know, influenced by anime, by K-drama, things like that. So I can say that for my own work, yes, absolutely. I think that, you know, looking even at stuff like, you know, looking at tech stories from 5-10 years ago that are suddenly becoming, you know, that were science fiction stories 10 years ago. My friend Tim Mon has written lots and lots of stories that were about sort of science, you know, ideas or technology ideas that were in development. And now they're sort of those same ideas, those same problems technologically are sort of like the subject of like a CSI episode, or the subject of like, you know, some other CBS procedural drama or whatever. So it takes time for these things to make it to the mainstream. And I think that, you know, the sooner you can engage with them, the better if they inspire you. I mean, obviously you don't want to be ticking boxes necessarily, but for me, I would say that, yeah, like there is definitely an influence. And what's funny is like watching it come around again and seeing it come around again. Cause there's moments where you're like, well, wait, I wrote that story 5 years ago, but you know, you have to let that go because it's a conversation. We exist in a conversation. The publishing landscape exists in a conversation. You know, you want people to pick up those ideas. You want them to continue that conversation for as long as it's relevant. And sometimes some of this is very relevant no matter what you do, no matter how long it's been. And so I think that yeah, like I do see that influence, and I really love seeing how ideas are picked over time. Actually, I really like seeing different people pick apart the same thing, actually.
In French Canada, there's I see a kind of first of all, there's kind of a lag because, you know, some of these trends, some of these works have to be translated and read by, we could say, native francophones. So right now, part of the production, I think, is still being shaped by dystopias, young adults dystopias sometimes, such as Hunger Games, and apocalyptic fiction going all the way back to The Road. But I'm also starting to see the influence, or at least an interest for not so much perhaps Afrofuturism, though some of the readers and critics are aware of it, but also indigenous futurism. And the work of Chéri de Madeline, which is perhaps not quite futurism, but certainly is bringing to the genre a new sensibility. And that is reflected in the fact that just in the last few months, a new imprint, Imaginaire, has been launched by two people in Montreal, and they have specifically said they were interested in reading books that, first of all, reflected a greater diversity of voices, but also might reflect indigenous futurism, Afrofuturism, as well as I'm just blanking there for a second. Yes, solar punk and solar punk stories. So it's we're talking of one imprint at one publisher, but yes, for about 2 or 3 years, the Francophone community of science fiction writers and readers has been aware of those trends, and now you're seeing that translated into real initiatives.
And just to build on solar punk, but also hope punk, and kind of tie it back to a little bit of what Jim had said, because the future, the real future, is not looking so bright right now, but also I feel like the past decade has been saturated with dystopian visions of the future. I think that those two have really converged for a lot of the writers, especially that I've been talking to, but also to the readers wanting more positive visions of the future. So this is where the hope punk movement kind of was born from, right? We need science fiction not just to point out what are the potential pitfalls and problems of technology, of climate, of politics, but what are the alternatives that could actually be good, right? And then to be able to frame stories that still have conflict and that are still interesting, but that are set in worlds that envision a brighter future overall, or at least different from, sort of the waterfall cliff that we think we're all heading towards right now. And so I personally have felt that too. Is like the things I love about solar punk is the concrete jungleization of our future, our vision of future cities and ways of life, right? And I think that's fantastic. I think we need to have that expressed in our popular science fiction, in the things that are widely read, preferably also in, popular media, on TV and film, because after a while, this kind of seeps into the collective consciousness, right? Just like exceptionalism drove this idea of space colonization and it became endemic, in order to shift the narrative, we need to have a lot of people writing a lot of stories and a lot of readers kind of absorbing that, yeah, this is okay, and maybe we can see the road to getting there. And if we can't see the road, we want to get there, so we're going to build the road to get there. So I just want to throw that in.
Okay, so I think we're going to go to our last big question, and I'll ask everybody to answer very briefly, like just a few words. So SF tropes have become mainstream: virtual reality, dystopias, post-apocalyptic scenarios, etc. Is there even a need for an SF genre anymore? Or do you see an essential difference between mainstream and SF tropes that are produced within the community? So is there a difference between SF that is produced by mainstream writers and SF that is produced within the genre? And are genre fictions even useful anymore, or were they ever? Let's start with Madeline.
I think that there is always a need to use narrative to explore the implications of science and technology. I think that we as a species tend to ask what if a lot, and using narrative to explore that is actually, I would say, one of our oldest information technologies is the story. And so I don't think that we can ever cure ourselves of it necessarily. I will say that further to Divya's point, I wrote a novel. I wrote a novel called Company Town, which was set in the near future. That took place on an oil rig. Everybody had healthcare. There were vertical farm towers. It was developing. It was totally self-sufficient energy wise. There were unionized sex workers. Everybody could eat. Everybody, everything was actually really great. And it was definitely called a dystopian novel. Still. So I think that there's also sort of a crisis of nomenclature, and that, inventing a different language to explore those possibilities is also part of that.
And I think that Nisi has something to add to all that.
Yes, I just want to say that I think that, I don't know if you would call it science fiction, but I will, is definitely going to be necessary as we approach the future and dive right into it, because the examples that you gave were all technological, and they were all mechanical and electrical, and there are so many other kinds of science. There are so many other kinds of technologies that we have yet to explore, and I'm thinking of social technologies. Going back to Kim Stanley Robinson, he gave a great speech about how communities develop along certain lines because they have certain practices, and we can think of these practices as technologies, and we can speculate on how they develop.
Thank you, Nisi. Why don't we hear from Jean-Louis next?
Thank you. Well, I'm struck, and I think there's still room for what could be called genre science fiction, or at the very least, the publishing space taken up by genre science fiction. And I think part of it has to do with the fact that when science fiction ideas, including climate fiction, dystopias, filter into the mainstream, they remain subordinated in some way to the expectations of the mainstream. Among other things, there is, I would say, this reluctance sometimes among mainstream authors to accept the possibility of radical change or wholesale change. And while the genre science fiction can still seem very pulpish in some ways, I think it does have this freedom to explore radical change. And just as an example, I'll cite the fact that I also did some research since the beginning of the pandemic on the prevalence of pandemic themes in science fiction. And it's amazing how in the last 10 years, pandemic science fiction kind of exploded 10 years before the coronavirus. And there are reasons for that, but somehow it was not mainstream that, in a sense, saw the pandemic coming. It was genre science fiction with stories of infected zombies and so on. So I think there's still room for genre science fiction.
Why don't we hear from Divya next?
All right. Yeah, I agree with everything everyone has said so far, and just wanted to add a couple of things to that. One is, I think an important part of having the genre continue is that the genre readership is different both in terms of its education and its expectations. And by education, I don't mean formal education. I mean the fact that they've been reading genre fiction for many, many years, and they know kind of what's in the canon, they know what's happening today. And so they are expecting people to be able to push that envelope versus the mainstream, for whom a lot of these ideas are shiny and new. And so they're presented in a very different way with different sets of expectations. So I think there's still a market to cater to, you know, the sophisticated genre reader, right? And the other thing is, I think there's a huge amount of space for questions that go beyond the near future into the far future, or speculations that don't necessarily fit into realms of plausibility. I mean, every typical alien invasion story that happens in Hollywood follows a particular formula, but in genre, they get explored with much more nuance. Or future space travel that, you know, kind of tying back to our entire conversation, that doesn't necessarily fit the colonialist, expansionist narrative. And I think these are easier to explore in genre, and I don't think a lot of mainstream readers would necessarily want to pick up a novel about something like that and to be able to follow it very easily. It wouldn't necessarily even fit what they expected by seeing a spaceship on the cover.
And let's end this final question with a few words from Jim.
Yeah, so I really agree with some of the things that Divya just said. I mean, I want to have a readership that I don't have to define every single thing on the spaceship by explaining that, drawing a diagram for how it works. If I say there is a scanner and I have some idea of how that scanner might work, I don't have to explain whether it's LiDAR or radar or whatever. You know, I'm happy to have that sort of sophisticated reader. And I also agree with what you said, what Divya said about the not near future, because I think that assuming we get over some of our current woes, which are pretty horrendous, there is still a lot of questions that science fiction has to ask, has been asking, that the mainstream is not asking. Like, what does it mean to be us? How much of what this body that we all have can be altered or changed before we're not us? Or maybe what science fiction job is to say that no matter how much we alter this body and that we came with, will still be us. And I think this is a question that science fiction, some of this science fiction, some of the science of this is a little rubbery, but it's not impossible. And the fact that we may be talking about, you know, AIs in the future, or we may be talking about being able to use different bodies, replacing our bodies. These are questions that I think that are way too wacky for the mainstream, but we've been looking at this stuff for a long time, and it's very interesting. And it goes to what it means to be a human. And that's what science fiction, I think, is its job of work in the future will be, to tell us what it means to be human.
I think those are great words to end on. That's a great capper. So I'd like to thank all of you. You did a great job. This was a great panel. Please say goodbye to our audience just before I go to the final matter. A quick goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye,
Bye-bye.
and thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Okay, well, thank you again, everybody. You're all amazing. And thanks to the audience for your questions. It really made our conversation a little more wide-ranging and a little deeper. So I hope you all enjoyed this FutureCon panel. In the panel description, just below this video, you'll find a number of links. There's the FutureCon website, which includes information on how to support FutureCon. I also invite you to subscribe to the YouTube channel so you can follow the convention, and to the Twitter account if you want to follow news about FutureCon, this FutureCon, and future FutureCons. And you can also participate in this international discussion by joining the FutureCon Discord community, which is open to everybody and which will continue to be active even beyond the convention itself. So again, I would like to thank everybody, both our panelists and the audience. And this was a great panel. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Right.
Happy trails.
Yes.
Bye.
Enjoy.
Thank you, Claude.
Live long.
Au revoir.
All right, guys, that was fantastic.